welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of many books. But we're here to discuss one beautiful work of historical fiction in particular today. I am so excited. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. I'm Donna Jones Alward, and my latest book is Ship of Dreams, which is set aboard Titanic. And it features two young women who are traveling to New York. One is trying to save her marriage. The other is trying to avoid the yoke of matrimony. They're best friends, but they're also keeping secrets from each other. And as we all know, secrets have a way of coming out. And that's going to happen just as Titanic is on a collision course with the iceberg. And so how that all unfolds.
It's really a fascinating book. But before I get to it too much, I'd love to ask you about your writing journey, what brought you to writing, and what got you interested in historical fiction after a lot of contemporary romance.
Yeah, so I'm actually coming up on my 20th anniversary of selling my first book. And I just signed the contract for my next book, which is my 70th, which is a bit crazy when you think about it. I spent a lot of years writing contemporary romance, which I love. But I've always been a huge reader of historical fiction. And just like lockdown was happening with the pandemic, I was thinking about trying something new. I was thinking about trying perhaps women's fiction or just something a little different, something a little broader and like a new challenge. And I got an email out of the blue from my now editor who heads up the imprint One More Chapter, which is an imprint of HarperCollins in London. And we kind of knew each other from my days, writing contemporary romance for Harlequin and Mills and Boon. And she emailed me and asked if I would be interested in writing Canadian set stories, which in itself is a really unusual but like very welcome request as a Canadian. And then if I'd be interested in rom-com or historical fiction. Maybe I was silly to say no to rom-com because it's totally having a moment. But I don't think that's where my skill lies necessarily. But the idea of writing historical fiction was really intriguing. And I just thought, you know what, like I'd been so intimidated by it before. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of research. I was afraid of getting things wrong. And then I just thought, you know what, I'm going to do it. And if it doesn't work out, then I'll do something else. But I think I would look back on it and regret it if I didn't try. And then it just happened to turn out really well. I released my first historical fiction in 2024 called When the World Fell Silent, and then followed it up with Ship of Dreams. And so my next book is also a historical fiction. So I'm kind of loving it. But that's how it came about. Like, you just don't know when opportunities are going to land on your doorstep, and then you get to decide what you're going to do with them.
It's so fascinating to me that I've been doing this show since 2021 now, and I still hear authors talk about projects sort of born or important parts of their career shifting, like during the pandemic. It seemed like when we had nothing else to do, it really kind of encouraged a lot of us to sort of look at what we really want to do and to go for it.
Yeah, I think so. And it really, like, I had been working almost full time outside the home as well. I say outside the home, I mean, I work from home, obviously, when I'm writing. So, I was actually working almost full time in a bookstore and loved it. But then, after the initial shutdown finished and I went back to work, I lasted like 6 weeks. And I was like, no, I gotta do full-time writing again. Like, and so I put in my notice and I just went all in again. And it really was a matter of, I think, having been off and just you're right. Just thinking about what we really want and what we really value, and then moving in that direction again. Yeah.
So this book, Ship of Dreams, I think it's fair to say that there's a lot of history and fiction about the Titanic out there, but this is so different. It really is unique in many ways. What inspired your take? What was the inception for this project?
That that's kind of a loaded question. What do you ask? Um, the original genesis was that I had my first book was set in Halifax in 1917 during the Halifax explosion, and I lived just outside Halifax, and there's a there are so many ties between the explosion and the Titanic sinking 5 years earlier and Halifax that a lot of people don't know about. And so anytime I did research into the explosion, a lot of times things referred back 5 years. And I thought, oh, Titanic. That's like interesting to all kinds of people around the world. Like it wasn't strictly a Canadian story, but there was such a big Canadian element. And I was really happy to work with that. But as far as the actual story of Hannah and Lou, I actually had two-thirds of the book written with totally different characters and been talking to my editor, and it just became very clear that it wasn't working at all. And rather than try to shoehorn the other characters sort of into an ill-fitting stew of plot and character type, I just said, no, I need to start over. So I actually throughout two-thirds of the book, it was like 65, 70,000 words, and just put them in a file and started over. And once I did that, like Hannah and Lou just came alive to me in my heart and my brain, and then on the page. And then it actually came together quite quickly. And the great thing was I didn't have to re-research or anything. The research still held up, but I just had different characters and different character arcs, and it just worked. So yeah, it was kind of it was a bit of a struggle to get the right story, but then once I did, it really came together.
That's so interesting because I loved both of these characters. I loved Hannah and Lou. And what's really interesting is that when I talk to romance writers, I love to ask about their approach to romantic tension or romantic conflict. But in some ways, friendship tension and conflict can be just as difficult for people to go through, if not more, because our friendships tend to have been around for longer than a lot of our romantic relationships.
Yeah.
So yeah, could you talk about crafting them both as characters and the sort of things that are not keeping them at odds or in conflict, but the source of tension between them on this journey?
Yeah, you're very right about friendship, and a lot of times those tensions, while not sexually charged like a romance would be, but they're still charged in a different way. And you're right, there is history, and especially with Hannah and Lou, they've been friends since they were girls. But they're very different women, and what I really liked to play with was how their differences were complementary at times, but then how their differences, sort of when put under pressure, uh, it, it caused some friction there. And they had never really kept anything from each other before, and now they're both keeping secrets, and that's also unusual. And so often it's about the things that aren't said, not necessarily the things that are said.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I really had a lot of fun playing with that, and the fact that they are very different women, and yet at the core, they're very much the same. Like they're very strong, ethical, caring people who very much feel like people should be able to choose what their life looks like. The problem is what they want their lives to look like is actually very different. And like I said, sometimes that that's refreshing, and then other times that creates problems between them. And I think neither one of them really want to come out and say it because they're afraid of damaging that relationship because it's so important. And so the more that isn't said, the worse things become until, you know, honesty has to happen. Yeah, so I really love playing with that dynamic. And I think there's so many different dynamics we can explore in fiction. And after, 17, 18 years of exploring the romantic element of that, I think there's relationships with friends, with family, like with sisters, with mothers, with bosses, with employers and employees in class and I'm talking just women relationships. Like I love being able to focus on female relationships and just how complicated and yet how not complicated they can be.
Mm. Yeah, because there's always, especially when you were looking back at history, when, women's rights were in a very different place, there's always between any two women like a source of sort of camaraderie in that like we are both oppressed by this system that doesn't let us do what we want to do or be what we want to be. But also then there are like, as you've said, like the class distinctions, the upbringing distinctions, all the different things that create differences within that commonality, if that makes sense. And that's such a, for me, like writing about women in historical fiction is always so fascinating because you're always going to have that conflict between like what a woman wants to do and what society is going to let her do, you know?
Right. And one of the things I loved was bringing in real passengers who were outliers in this way. So, Margaret Brown, and Helen Candy Churchill and Renee Harris, and women who were doing things that society would deem completely inappropriate or inaccessible, and they're doing them anyway. And they're very willing to reach a hand back to the woman behind them. And and I really loved now. Who's to say if those conversations really would have happened? But it was fiction, so I got to play with it, and I was very happy to explore also that dynamic of women in community and supporting each other and helping each other.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really lovely. And even though, any Titanic story involves a measure of tragedy, like it is also very uplifting and affirming.
Yeah, and part of the reason why the first version of this story didn't work was because the actual story I was writing was also not uplifting. It would have been in the end, but getting there was not. And with the Titanic tragedy being so dark, I didn't have the light to balance out the darkness, and it was it was a bit of a drag. And I was fighting with it as I was writing it and not really getting what was wrong. And then my editor sent a couple of really long emails about, what really wasn't working. And it's frustrating, but also beautiful that she is almost always completely right. Uh, so yeah, it really was about bringing in some light to balance the dark. And the truth is, in those first 4 days, people were like living the beautiful life. They didn't know what was coming, and it's not to say they didn't have problems. I mean, that's where the story comes through with their dynamic. But yeah, it really was, sort of this beautiful crossing, glamorous and hopeful, and then everything changes. And that was also just really, I had a lot of fun writing this once I got it to the right place. Like just so much of, light and dark, happiness and grief. The friendship is fraught, and then, there's healing, and just playing with all of those dichotomies was so fun.
Yeah, I bet. So that brings us to, I think, what makes your story so unique in Titanic stories is that you spend a lot of time on the aftermath and the immediate experience of survivors, which is not something that I was had ever really read about or learned about, and I thought it was so, so fascinating. So it sounds like what you mentioned earlier, some of the research for this book came out of your previous project, but specifically, like what sort of sources did you look at about, how survivors were processed at Halifax and the ship of widows, which, it never occurred to me that, like, of course, most of the survivors were going to be women because of how they boarded the lifeboats,
Right. And, the truth of the matter is, first class women were probably the luckiest people on board. And yet, all the money in the world couldn't save their husbands or, the single rich men who were on board. So, as far as Halifax, there's a place called the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic, and they have both a permanent exhibit for the Halifax explosion, and then upstairs, there's also a permanent exhibit for Titanic. And there are lots of local books on it as well. And so that was actually the easiest part of my research, was looking at how people how survivors came here, and then how the bodies were brought back here when they were retrieved from the ocean. And there's a cemetery here, so of course I visited the cemetery, and there's about 150 people buried here, give or take. So I visited that, and so there were lots of resources about that. And also, because I live here, I was able to actually like look at the street map from that time as well, and work out where people would have stayed, and that kind of thing. Yeah, so that was really fun, and I think I was excited about that part because it's a part that most people don't know about. And so I was very excited to shed some light on that actual event, because a lot of people are like, oh, we landed in New York, and then it skips over to whatever. But the truth is, there was a whole chunk of stuff that happened in, our little port city here. And like our city was in mourning. Windows were draped with black, and people went to the ship, the McKay Bennett, when it came in. There were horse-drawn hearses waiting to transport bodies to the curling club, which is where most of the bodies were processed. And then also a really interesting fact about the registrar here for vital statistics, who devised what is now known as the Barnstead method. His name was J.H. Barnstead. But because there were so many bodies, he devised a whole system of cataloging personal effects, the condition of the body, clothing, like anything that identified them, and keeping that all together based on a number. And that is still used for any sort of mass casualty event. That process, and to think that was developed again in our little Canadian city over 100 years ago, and set the standard for future identification in mass casualty events, I find that incredibly interesting. But it was a really great opportunity for me to sort of shine a light on all that while my characters are doing their thing, and having to deal with what's happened in their lives without giving spoilers.
Yeah, I've been trying really hard to avoid spoilers here. But it is so interesting because so many Titanic stories just cut from like, the people who make it into the lifeboats survive. And then you cut to like, your decades later and everybody is like, you know, living their lives. But like that immediate aftermath, I never thought about how like the emergency was not over when you got in the lifeboat. There was a lot more hardship and heartbreak to go through after that. It was really
Yeah,
touching to me.
yeah, and I think that was the part that I really wanted to focus on, because I guess maybe because I read a lot of nonfiction, but I also read a lot of fiction set during the sinking and that time period, and it wasn't something that had been done before. And we're always looking for fresh ways to tell familiar stories. So I'm glad that worked.
It's so interesting to me because I was before I was a librarian, I was a trained historian, and every little historical event or historical figure or place, like is like a multifaceted diamond almost. You could just like turn it a little bit and shine a light on a new facet and like get an entirely different experience or perspective or story. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so often, I mean, it's slightly, well, everything's political, but it's slightly political to say that the way history is recorded is generally from the perspective of the people in power or the
Mhm.
people, and generally it's white men. And so to be able to, I'm so fascinated by the current excitement and enthusiasm to bring women's perspectives into history
Mm.
and stories that wouldn't be told from that perspective. And some of those perspectives, they are not my story to tell, but I endeavor to make sure that they're at least acknowledged within my stories, because it's not just you know straight white people who are affected by these things. It's everybody, and so I do try to bring that forward. Yeah, so I think in the near future, at least, women-centered stories are kind of going to be my jam.
Nice. So is that what you have planned next as well? You hinted at your next historical fiction.
Yeah, I just I've been working on it for a while, but we just finalized the contract. Everything's signed, and it is set during. It's a World War II story, which I am a huge World War II fiction fan, like huge, huge, huge. And it's so funny that my first two stories were not World War II at all, since I gravitate toward it. But it is a Canadian wireless operator at Camp X, which was a spy training school in Ontario. And she goes on to become an SOE agent, and she is teamed up with another SOE agent who is English, who has been in France already and has her own story. And the two of them are sent back to France together in the lead up to D-Day. And because of their unique past, they don't actually work as a team very well in the beginning. So there's a lot of trying to face their demons so that they can come together and accomplish their mission ahead of the D-Day landing. So yeah, it's called, at least for now, it's called Codename Songbird. I always say until it's final enough on the retailers for sale, you never know what's going to happen with the title. But it's called Codename Songbird, and it'll be out next year. It'll be out mid 2027.
Oh, wow. That's very exciting. I guess,
It is. I feel like I've bit off more than I can chew with it, because now I'm writing a story set in three separate settings. So I have Canada and Camp X, and then I do have a whole chunk that is set in England, and then of course a big chunk that's set in France. And yeah, and researching all of that has been interesting. So it's a little more ambitious than I think my earlier books, but I'm having a lot of fun writing it because I do love this time period. Love it.
So with when you're writing about something like World War II, which is like there's so much history written about it, like academic history and popular histories and stuff, is that harder to work with than when you're dealing with a more obscure subject that has fewer sources, or does more sources mean easier writing? Did that question make sense?
It sure does. And the answer is yes, to whatever you said, because honestly, in some ways it's easier, and in some ways it's more difficult. I do worry about getting things wrong more, because there is so much known. And actually, I face that a bit with writing Ship of Dreams, because there's such a huge fandom around anything Titanic. So I actually faced that a bit as well, and honestly found contradictory sources. So really had to make sure that I dug a little deeper to see, if not what was quote unquote true, what was the most accepted version of, what is more likely to show up as accurate, which is kind of a weird place to be. So in some ways it's easier because I can access photos and things more, which is great. But sometimes you can get down a rabbit hole and it's just too much stuff. And at some point, you need to write the story. And it's also important to remember that the story, like while this one will culminate in D-Day and then aftermath of D-Day, the story is actually not D-Day. The story is actually these two women and their journey from, what drove them to become agents during the war and what toll that takes on them and how that manifests in their lives. And so I have to remember that the story is actually the characters and not the history. Mm-hmm. And that's a big challenge, especially if you love the history and you tend to like nerd out on it a lot. Yeah. And then you realize that, oh, wait, my characters haven't spoken for 2 pages because I've, waxed on about something. So yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge for me is just remembering that the characters are the story and everything else is setting, Yeah. It's setting and timeline. So yeah, it's a balancing act.
Absolutely. Well, happy writing. Thank you for taking the time out to talk to me and our listeners. I have a feeling this one, I've already recommended it to folks at the library where I work. It's just such a really lovely story that I think a lot of people think they know, but they really don't. There's so much, in the aftermath of the sinking that happened that is also absolutely fascinating and heartbreaking. So thank you for shining a light on it.
Well, thank you. And just a quick little note before we go. If you've gotten to the end of Ship of Dreams, or when your listeners get to the end of Ship of Dreams and they're reading through those final pages, if I say that there is a link between the end of Ship of Dreams and Codename Songbird, hopefully they'll go, oh, like how's that going to work? And yeah, so we do have some characters show up from the end of Ship of Dreams in Codename Songbird.
That's wonderful. Or I'm even more excited now. That's great.
Honestly, Hannah and Lou would not leave me alone, and there's some other bits in there as well. And I just thought, I'm just not ready to say goodbye yet, like completely. So, yeah.
Nice. Oh, I love it. Well, I am so excited to read the next one, and I am so excited to talk about this more at the library. So, listeners, you have your homework. Please check out Ship of Dreams. It's out now. It'll be out when you hear this, so you can head to your favorite bookstore or library, wherever you like to go for books. All right. Thank you, everybody. It's time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.